We are, in fact, turning to a very important topic to round us out here. That is the Iran deal. And we are very happy to be joined here. I guess I have to say that, but we are very happy to be joined here by Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Ben, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here. Lovely, Rania, to have you in our studio. Receive together. It really warms my heart.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Last time you were on, you said this was your favorite show. Hopefully we're still there in the top spot.
Before the dad jokes started, yeah.
Whatever, man. I know it was the highlight of the show.
You guys can go back and forth on dad jokes all day. We'll make that a show. Obviously it seems, Ben, that we are reaching something of a, well, let me not say that. It appears we may be reaching something of an end game as it concerns whatever's going to happen with the Iran deal. All the reports saying that something is either going to happen or not very soon. What is the state of play right now with the Iran deal? It feels like it's gone back and forth so many times. It's almost like Lucy pulling away the football every time you hear something's going to happen. Does it seem like there could be some sort of deal? Could the deal be returned to in the near future? Does it look like that, or is it still too opaque?
It is opaque. I think it's possible. If we had done the interview a week ago, I would say very unlikely. But it seems there has been movement in the last 48 hours. But it really actually depends on which reporter, which publication, which source they're relying on. Because you could see very different headlines from all the mainstream publications right now about whether they think a deal is likely. Other things to look at are, for instance, what the investors are doing. Obviously, the price of oil has dropped in the last couple days. I think that's on anticipation of a potential deal, which would mean more oil supply coming into the market. So in that sense, people are getting, there's a sense of anticipation or optimism. On the other hand, like Goldman Sachs tells its investors, don't get ahead of yourselves. We think it's unlikely. We think both countries, the US and Iran, the two main signatories, that they actually have a vested interest in a stalemate. So I think there's a lot of conflicting information. Obviously, when the EU put out its version of the deal, and we should really have to go through the whole history of the deal to really understand it, they said this is the final version. But Iran said, without accepting it or rejecting it, that they had certain concerns. They said these current concerns need to be addressed. And it seems, all the concerns they put out are obviously quite reasonable. So you would think that this would not be a deal breaker. And in fact, Mohammed Morandi, who's actually been on the show or on Breakthrough several times, who's functioning as an advisor to the negotiating team of Iran, he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that he thinks they should be easily resolved. So I think there are sort of glimmers of hope of a potential return to the deal, but there's a lot of interest who are opposed to such a deal, and there's a lot of obstacles still in the way, and there's a lot of history. And that history, people really have to understand. It's not that Iran is being obstinate or whatever it is. Like the Wall Street Journal headline is Iran balks at the finish line. And the whole way in which these phrases and headlines are constructed, you would think that Iran is just run by crazy hardliners who don't want to do anything because the U.S. is the great Satan and so forth. But as if there's no justification to be extremely wary of such a deal, especially given that we are 2 years from the next presidential election. And if Biden gets back into the deal, Trump could do the exact same thing he did if he were to win in 2024 and exit the deal. So you have to say that this is a reasonable concern for a country the size of Iran to think, well, what if we make all sorts of concessions and again the rug is pulled from underneath our feet 2 years or 3 years from now?
Yeah, it is funny the use of the term hardliner, which is a term that the West uses to where, the Iranians don't call themselves hardliners. But you can
Mike
easily
Pompeo,
say this.
Ultimate hardliner, John Bolton, hardliner. Anyway, I totally agree with you.
No, it is the word itself. It's like, you're right. Why isn't that ever applied to the U.S., which actually, like you mentioned, ripped up the deal? And that's been one of Iran's greatest points of contention here, which is totally legitimate, is the Biden administration has repeatedly told them, we can't guarantee that the next administration won't rip up this deal. So why on earth, why would anybody in their right mind in that situation get back into a deal where the person in charge of it is saying we could just easily violate it and rip it up and say it doesn't matter? That said, the Europeans are quite desperate right now, right? That's a part of the reason why you mentioned oil prices. That's a part of the reason why there is optimism this deal might go through, because the Europeans are begging the Americans, please let us return to this deal because we need other energy to rely on. Can you talk a bit about, the way that the war in Ukraine and the desperate energy needs of the Europeans are connected to the revival of this deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big storyline of the Ukraine war, when you think about it, is how Western Europe has prostrated itself and subordinated itself entirely to U.S. interests at its own expense. I mean, energy is going to be rationed, or already is in the process of being rationed in major countries in Western Europe. The fall and winter are coming, as the Iranian negotiators are very coyly putting out on Twitter. Things are going to get cold soon. They actually have like a deadline where they have to make some deal to bring some new energy supplies into their market. And, you know, Germany, France, by canceling the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, by decoupling in all these tremendous ways, they are obviously going to hurt the living standards of their own people, hurt businesses, corporations, industrialists, and sorts of things in the Western European economy are going to be affected if there's not a rapid conclusion to the Ukraine war. And it makes them more and more desperate for new oil to come into the market from Iran. Now, the big storyline when you go back even further is how Europe also subordinated itself when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Remember, the Iran nuclear deal had 7 signatories, the UN Security Council plus Germany, the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany and Iran. And when Trump exited the deal, the European countries said, well, we still want to do business with Iran. Major European corporations, the largest oil conglomerates in Europe, including, and then also some U.S. businesses, Boeing, Airbus, they immediately signed contracts with Iran for tens of billions of dollars because it was supposed to be a new day of commerce between Iran, a major economy with huge oil reserves, and Europe. And then Trump exits the deal, and Europe for a moment says, well, just because Trump is exiting, we're going to stand up to Trump, and we're going to, you know, we're going to see through our part of our commitments, and we're going to make money, as you would think the French capitalist and German capitalist class would want to do, and the British capitalist class would want to do. But because of the financial imperialism, the dollar hegemony, and the fact that so many financial institutions then would be sanctioned by the United States for violating essentially U.S. law, not violating French laws or German laws or British laws by doing deals with Iran, but U.S. laws. Those same banks then said, we're not going to process transactions with Iran. So all of these tens of billions of dollars in contracts were basically shredded. And all the businesses that had been set up were immediately eliminated. And you would think this would have been the ideal moment for France and Germany and these other countries that wanted to, you know, show their independence and show that they were standing up to Trump, to just say, well, we're going to go ahead anyway, and we're going to protect our banks and so forth and our companies. But they didn't do it. They ultimately all backed down to Trump, the big bully, and they just sort of cowered in the corner. And now they're paying the consequence too. Now with the Ukraine war, it's the same thing all over. And they again are saying, really begging the U.S., please, please, please allow us to do business with Iran. Please, won't you sign the deal? So they have made some big concessions in the last few days, where it could be big concessions. We'll see. One, for instance, is to allow non-U.S. businesses to contract with entities in Iran that are linked to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard. Now, this would essentially say we're going to protect them from U.S. sanctions. European businesses that are dealing with Iranian companies, as long as they're not like directly linked with the IRGC. This would open up a lot if they were to actually do it. And I think it actually is a sign of their desperation and the fact that they're very anxious about what the fall and winter look like.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many elements to this. I mean, it just seems so amazing. I mean, I can totally remember when, you know, the axis of evil was announced, you know, and the Bush administration was like, we're going to get Iraq, then we're going to get Iran, then we're going to get North Korea, we're going to get Syria, we're going to get everybody. And this just unbelievable hubris of the United States, which, you know, really it feels like this is so much of the blowback of that, yet we're still seeing the same hubristic behavior. I mean, you can't have maximum pressure on all countries all the time, but it's like everyone in American politics can agree we should all hate China. But outside of that, there's not that much agreement on like who else we should be hating. But it does feel like this really does put a monkey wrench in the context of what Obama was trying to do by introducing the Iran deal, which is make it easier for the U.S. to disengage and do more to isolate and surround China. But anyway, I'm rambling now, but it just feels like you look at the chain of events of U.S. foreign policy since, let's say, 2002, and so much of of everything that determines this is you can't call them blunders, but the unbelievable fallout from these terrible, imperialist decisions.
When you think about it, why is it that the U.S. can't really work with Iran? Like, what is it about Iran? Iran is essentially a capitalist country. Yes, it has religious law and religious rulers, but the U.S. works with lots of countries that do. So what is it? And in fact, Iran supported the first invasion of Iraq. And in the 1990s, Iran, the United States ruling classes, although not having official relations, obviously had a certain understanding between the two of them. And I think you're right to identify the neoconservatives in the early 2000s for really wrecking that relationship. They basically said, we're going to create a whole hit list of countries. And they actually did believe we can do maximum pressure and military intervention on many countries, one by one, either sequentially or at once, and that somehow that's going to hold up. But this current moment, that does not work. If you want to put all your basket of goods to Russia, well, either that's going to push Russia into the arms of other countries, or that's going to create supply chain shortages. It's going to create shortages of oil supplies. I mean, some of these countries actually have the natural resources that the West relies upon. So you can't have maximum pressure against all of them at the same time, unless one, you're going to force them all into a separate global economy where they all work together, or two, you're basically going to shoot yourself in the foot. So there has to be some understanding where you have to pick who your real enemies are. I think that's what the U.S. ruling class is starting to realize, and certainly the European ruling classes have already realized. But there is this sector of the militarist, the most aggressive, the foreign policy establishment, the core of it, that seems to not quite still understand this. And they still think that you can just basically put maximum pressure on Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, all these countries that are very resource rich, and there's going to be nothing that happens. But if you look at the fallout of the Iraq War, I'll just say this. Iran was a major beneficiary in a sort of regional political sense of the Iraq War, because Iraq as a country could only be stabilized with the assistance of Iran, or with Iran playing a bigger role in Iraqi politics. The U.S. took out the Afghan government and the Iraqi government, on both sides of Iran. Iran, therefore, in a way, becomes stronger within the region. And then we wag our finger at Iran and say, Iran is getting stronger in the region. How dare it get stronger in the region?
The word you're thinking of is malign influence.
Yes, the malign influence. And so there's something kind of ridiculous in that the U.S. policies never seem to register as like, there's actually fallout and consequences for all of these things. So yes, Iran's influence has grown in the region. And now what Obama wanted to do was pivot to Asia. He said, we're spending too much time, energy, resources. We can't be at war with all these countries at once. We want to pivot to Asia. So he wanted to basically put the Iran situation on ice as a frozen conflict. Trump comes and he wants to rebalance things. He wants to be maybe a little bit friendlier towards Russia, but he wants to increase the hostility towards Iran. So you have these two wings of the U.S. ruling class, or maybe it's 3 or 4 wings, I don't know, which is no bird can fly with 3 or 4 wings. They're all sort of undercutting each other depending on who's in power at the same time. And as you said, the only thing they seem to agree upon is giant military budgets and encircling China.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it that way, because you do have the sort of, like you mentioned, the ruling class is like a bit conflicted over who we should be focused on, right? In the case right now, Democrats want to really focus on Russia. Republicans are like, no. I mean, it's a very general statement. Obviously, it's not that black and white, but the sort of like MAGA right wants to focus on China. Like, our real enemy is China. Obviously, both sides hate both countries. But it reminds me of this Washington Post article that came out within the last couple of weeks by Josh Rogan, I think is his name.
Christ, yeah.
He's like their resident sort of neoconservative, but like under the age of like 40, I think.
Totally.
But anyways, the whole article was basically arguing, no,
one
you
guy that
guys.
could find under 40 who's going to be for wars.
Yeah, but
yeah.
But his whole argument was that we can confront Russia and China at the same time. We don't have to choose, and it is this hubris, the hubris you're talking about, to believe that there are no limits to American power projection. We can just maximum pressure everyone. But what's also interesting about everything you just said is that with Iran, on top of like Iran gaining influence, I mean, you always heard these neocons whining about the road from Tehran to Beirut. And what they meant by that, with the Shia axis, right? That was what they would say very offensively. And what they meant by that was Iran and the groups in Iraq allied with Iran, with the Hashd-e-Shaabi or the Popular Mobilization Forces, and then Syria, and then, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And by saying that and worrying about that and pursuing all these policies to try to be an obstacle to that, they actually like created what they were so scared of, because there really is this, I wouldn't call it a road, but there's what's called the resistance axis across the Middle East. And that is what also upsets these people so much, is Iran is the main backer of all the groups they call terrorists across the Middle East, which of course in the Middle East, they don't necessarily call them terrorists. They would call them resistance fighters, from, the Palestinian resistance groups to Hezbollah and so on. So it's just interesting. I mean, and now I'm rambling, but it is interesting how all of these policies end up really creating exactly what America is so terrified of.
And I think we have to try to identify what is the underlying contradiction here. Because from an economic standpoint, you want stability. I mean, that's what Goldman Sachs and the others that I started off talking about. They want stability. If you look at, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz, which we might have a map of, I hope we do. But the Strait of Hormuz, which the Iranian naval forces essentially control.
There we go.
Okay, this little area here. I mean, this is where 1/3 of the liquefied natural gas of the world comes through. And I think it's like 1/6 or 1/7 of the oil goes through this little strait of water that the Iranian military essentially could shut down if it wanted to. It would be a world historic event that would change the economy, change politics, change the world, perhaps trigger major military conflicts. So that hasn't happened yet. But this is not like a little country that you can just bully forever and think that nothing's going to happen. This country actually can impact global trade beyond just their own oil reserves, just based on its coasts. So you have this contradiction where, on one hand, capitalism needs stability. But if you have a stable world order, you also have these countries which are big, have big populations, militaries, economies. They'll be able to rise within that world order and therefore challenge the United States. So how can you actually create a stable, like if you step back from it, how can you create a stable Middle East? Like that's the phrase they always use, that doesn't include Iran, or that doesn't include tens of millions of Shia people in the countries that you named. Of course, they have to have their interests represented. They have to be respected in that. If you actually want a stable Middle East, you have to work with the countries that are actually there. And so on the other hand, you have people who say, if we have a stable, peaceful world, the United States will not be able to survive as the sole hegemon. So therefore, you have an interest in stoking instability, in cutting countries off from one another, actually making the cost of doing business far greater than they would have to be. But it's all for political and military interests of the United States. And that's basically the same thing that we're seeing in China. That's the same thing we're seeing in Russia. So there's this contradiction between sort of stability and instability, both driven by different imperatives in the political economic order. From purely economic standpoint, you want stability, but because the world is not just, corporations, but governments and systems and militaries, which have vested political interests, they actually have an interest in destabilizing their own system. And that's why I think we're seeing all this confusion, even from U.S. elites, because some want to push it a little bit further, some want to pull back a little bit, some say we've gone too far, some say we need to restrain. They can't quite figure out the balance. We like to think of the rulers as some omniscient group that has this perfect formula in a smoky room where they figured it all out. But I think to the extent that existed for maybe a short period in U.S. history, that period is over.
It's like capitalism is short-circuiting.
Yeah, I mean it has that feel. I mean it really has that kind of video game feel where you're like going into the wall. Like they just have no idea like what they're doing and they just keep running into the wall over and over and over again. I mean on so many different fronts and in
But
so
it's
many
the
different
rest of the world that pays the price. You know what I mean? I
Yes.
mean, that's the other part of that. They're running into the wall, but it's the people of Iran who are having their living standards affected. Tens of millions of people who are living worse off than they could be, dealing with hunger and electricity shortages and all sorts of problems that could be easily solvable. So I mean, I think we should smirk at it and we should shake our heads at it, but we also have to be fundamentally outraged about that.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, for whatever reason, maybe because I hate myself, I'd like to say because I just like to be well informed of things that are happening. I watched both seasons of that Apple TV show Tehran.
I watched
which
the first
was
episode.
I mean, it was well.
so
I'll put you
bad.
like this: and as a TV show, it's not that bad. But the thing about it that is really notable to me is that it's constantly, obviously the key players of this Israeli secret agent and these Iranian opposition people, and it gives a ton of voice. This is actually, I don't know, I'm about to get into cultural criticism, but it gives a ton of voice to these Iranian opposition people, and they're constantly referencing all these problems in Iran, which if you study Iran, you know some of these things are problems. And all capitalist countries have these problems. So if you lifted the sanctions, it's not like they'd go away magically overnight, but like unemployment, lack of job opportunities, inflation, all these things that are very heavily affected by sanctions. Never once in the 2 seasons did they mention sanctions of any sort on Iran or the impact of it. They don't even really put it in the mouths of the Iranian, government officials they have. So it's a deliberate omission on the part of the show, but it's a very popular show.
It's like an Israeli show, right?
It is an Israeli show.
Which is why we didn't hear those things. Yeah.
But Glenn Close is in season 2, so a lot of people are going to watch shows like this, right, and say like, "Oh, I mean, I love Glenn Close. I love Glenn Close," and you're going to get this. It reminds me a lot of Homeland, which has also had a lot of Iranian propaganda, anti-Iranian propaganda.
Also an Israeli producer, I think.
Absolutely, where it's like sort of prestige TV, and it does give you a more realistic look than most sort of American shows do into these parts of the world, but it omits these key factors that these kind of things, like this is the role of Hollywood as well as the media. I was talking about this with Afghanistan as well, that these things kind of lodge in your brain, and you don't know exactly how they're working in your subconscious, but then you hear these things about Iran being obstinate or hardline or whatever, and it starts to kind of, pop back up and put it in there. And it's very pernicious how these things exist all across our society to give us these blinkered views of what's happening.
Yeah. Here's another one. Think about the smuggling of Iranian oil.
Yeah.
Okay, there probably is a lot of smuggling going on because any company that openly transacts in Iranian oil can be shut down and basically would tank their business. But just by saying that over and over, smuggling, you would think that there's some global law against buying Iranian oil. No, it's just U.S. sanctions against other entities from operating in their sort of financial system. And so just by using that phrase, you've already sort of locked in your brain that Iran is the criminal and the law-abiding one is the U.S. When Iran complied totally with all of its commitments under the JCPOA. That's not me saying it. That's the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's all the independent inspectors. Iran complied. Iran actually downgraded its enriched uranium, the centrifuge development, and so forth. It did all these changes that actually set back its nuclear program, which also it is legally allowed to have. It is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You're allowed to have civilian nuclear energy. That's not, against the law of the world. Israel has nuclear weapons. Many people would say, why doesn't Iran have the right to nuclear weapons as well? But Iran has always said it's not developing a nuclear weapon program. My point being is that if you're watching the same events and you try to put yourself in the shoes of an Iranian person, a working class person, or a person who is proud to be Iranian, you would think, okay, we've done all of these things. We've basically capitulated or we've conceded on many things that many countries are not asked to concede upon. All we asked to do is basically be able to be a normal actor in the world financial system, and yet we're still portrayed as the criminals, as the smugglers, and so forth, and the U.S. as the good guys. By Trump pulling out of that deal, I mean, it's hard to overstate what that really meant. It violates the most basic principles of fairness that you would learn in first grade. If you agree to something, you fulfill it. You can't just pull out and then tell the other guy, you got to do everything we demanded, but I'm not going to do my part. So when Iran starts to do little things at the edges to show, look, we're not going to concede our core national interests and get nothing in return, then all the Western press says Iran violates the nuclear deal. And even the Europeans, they start to initiate the dispute mechanisms, saying just because the US backed out of the Iran nuclear deal doesn't mean that Iran no longer has commitments. Of course that's what it means, because Iran is basically getting nothing. So like, when you start to look at the world and these major world situations, not from the perspective of an American who's just consuming US news, but the perspective of these countries that are constantly being bullied, it really changes your whole perspective. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do at Breakthrough News. It's not that we can speak for the people of the global South, but we're trying to bring a lot of other guests on who are going to help people understand that this way of looking that we've been taught, that we've been raised and grown up with, is not the only way to look at the world.
I think that's 100% right. I think that's certainly what we're trying to do here at Breakthrough News. There's obviously quite a bit to watch as this story continues to unfold, and we will be here for you at Breakthrough News to help break it down as best we can. Editor-in-Chief of Breakthrough News, Ben Becker, once again, thank you for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Great show.
Thank you very much.